Every story matters. Every voice counts. You're listening to Cambridge Veritas, where your learning journey becomes the story.
Welcome, teachers, to this deep dive with us here at Cambridge Veritas. I'm Monica, and as fellow trainers, Nick and I know how valuable your time is. You're always looking for ways to make your lessons more engaging and more effective.
Absolutely. And today we're focusing on something that's always there in the classroom, the ever-present coursebook. I'm Nick, by the way.
The coursebook, so our aim today is to figure out how to make it really work for you and your students.
Exactly. Moving beyond just turning the page.
Right, beyond just like, okay, next page, next activity.
Yeah.
We're going to dive into our materials and pull out some practical strategies, things that you can actually use in your classroom right away to make that learning happen and keep those students actively involved.
That's the mission.
Okay, so Nick, let's think about the coursebook itself for a moment. Sometimes you hear the argument that relying heavily on a coursebook can kind of de-skill teachers, almost as if it limits your professional judgment. What are your initial thoughts on that perspective?
Well, yeah, I think it's a perspective that's out there, definitely, and I can understand where it's coming from. Some might feel like it stifles creativity or even, like you said, reduces that sense of autonomy. But I think we think about the reality of being a teacher, how much you have to do. The coursebook does offer a huge advantage. It provides those pre-prepared materials and a structured curriculum. So that could be so valuable when you're so busy, you have so many things to do.
Absolutely. When I first started teaching, I felt like I was creating everything from scratch, and having a well-structured coursebook was such a relief. It gave me a foundation to build on. But it doesn't mean that we have to treat it like the ultimate authority, right? Every single activity, every single text.
Yeah, exactly. You don't have to use everything. And I think that's a key point here. It's about being selective. So it's almost like thinking about the coursebook as a colleague, almost like a critical friend, not as something that's telling you what to do every step of the way. You don't have to use everything in it.
Right.
So I think preview is so important. Before you even start a course, look at the whole book and then look at each unit and think, okay, what's really essential for my students? What's not so useful? And what can I use to save some time?
That makes total sense. It's like having a map, but knowing you might need to take a detour or adjust the route depending on who you are traveling with and where you are going. What about involving the students in this process? How could a teacher do that practically?
That's a really good point, Monica, about giving students that sense of ownership and agency. You can give them like a brief overview of the topics and the types of activities that you're going to be doing, maybe at the beginning of the unit or even at the beginning of the course.
Right.
And then just simply ask, which ones interest you the most? Which ones are you not so keen on? You can even do a quick poll or have them do a little questionnaire.
I like that.
And I think that's really useful because, first of all, it gives them a preview.
Right.
Like you were talking about with the map. It kind of gets them ready for what's coming up. And secondly, when students feel like their opinions are valued, they buy into it more.
Exactly. They feel like they are part of the process, not just passive recipients.
Exactly. It really does increase their motivation, and they're much more likely to engage with the material.
I love that shift in dynamic. Instead of just saying, okay, here's the curriculum, it's more like, let's explore this together.
Right.
So the key message here is that the coursebook is a valuable tool.
Yeah, it is.
But you, as the expert teacher, and your students' needs those, should really guide how you use it.
Yeah,
So
definitely.
strategic selection is key.
Exactly.
Okay, so we're being selective with the content, but what about how we engage the students with the exercises we do choose? There's this classic interaction pattern that we often see, and even that coursebooks can sometimes lean towards, which is that teacher asks, student answers, that kind of ping-pong style. What are some of the limitations you think with that approach?
Well, the first one that comes to mind is time. It could be so slow, going from one student to the next. And while one student's answering, what's the rest of the class doing? They're probably thinking about what they're having for dinner
Or checking their phones.
Yeah, or checking their phones.
Right. And often it's the same few students who are always eager to answer, while others who might need more encouragement or who are a little bit shy, they just stay silent. And then that can lead to boredom and disengagement for a lot of the learners.
Absolutely. And I think sometimes course books present these exercises without really giving us much guidance on how to do them differently.
Right.
But, our materials, do they have some really useful ideas for breaking out of that ping-pong rut? So let's explore those.
Yeah, let's do that.
Okay, so first up, we've got this typical ping-pong style interaction where you ask the question, one student answers.
Right, one at a time.
Yeah, and that can really limit participation. So instead of that, why not have students do their own small group ping-pong?
Interesting.
So in their small groups, One student takes on the role of the teacher.
Okay.
It's not about being the expert. It's more about getting them to engage actively with those questions and answers, but in a smaller, less intimidating setting. And then they only come to you as the facilitator when they really get stuck.
Oh, I see.
So your role shifts a bit. You're more of a guide on the side.
Yeah, so you're not at the front of the classroom, you're moving around.
Exactly. You're moving around. You're listening to their discussions. You're offering help where it's needed rather than giving all the answers.
And that encourages peer learning as well, right?
Absolutely. It boosts their confidence as they work through those challenges together.
We also saw some suggestions for simple pair work, both oral and written,
Yeah.
individual written tasks, and even time-limited written exercises, which could be done individually or in pairs. And those seem like such small tweaks.
Yeah, they do.
But they could have a really big impact on student involvement, couldn't they?
Absolutely. I mean, even just pair work, that automatically doubles the amount of participation.
Right.
And it gives students that safe space to practice speaking and get feedback from each other, which is so important for language learning. And then you've got individual written work, which allows students to process things in their own time and, think a bit more deeply.
Yeah.
And those time-limited tasks, that just adds a little bit of pressure.
Right, a little bit of excitement, maybe.
Exactly. It keeps them on their toes.
It's like a little challenge.
It is.
Okay, so you've got all this varied interaction going on, but what's the teacher doing during all this? Are they just kind of observing from afar?
Not at all, Monica. Our materials emphasize how important it is to move around the classroom.
Right.
You're offering support. You're monitoring how they're doing.
So you are really present in the classroom.
Absolutely. Your presence is key. You can see who's struggling, who needs a bit of extra help.
And offer that help right there in the moment.
Right there in the moment.
Rather than waiting for a chance to address it later.
Exactly. And then when it's time to check answers, it doesn't have to be that long, drawn-out process of going through each one with the whole class.
Right.
You could do a quick ping-pong round with the whole class just to highlight those key answers.
Right, because they've already had a chance to process it in their groups or in pairs.
Exactly. Or you could just give them the answers.
Right.
Or write them on the board.
And have them self-check.
Exactly. Much more efficient.
So the main benefit here is that we are increasing participation and engagement.
Definitely. More students are involved. They're active in the learning process.
And that leads to deeper understanding.
Absolutely.
Right. Okay, so we're moving beyond just that one-to-one interaction between teacher and student. Now let's talk about the exercises themselves. A lot of grammar and vocabulary tasks in course books tend to have that single correct answer.
Yeah.
But our training materials today, we're talking about unlocking creativity by allowing for multiple right answers. So how does that work in practice?
This is where it gets really interesting, Monica. It's about taking those closed-ended exercises and turning them into more open-ended activities.
Okay.
The basic idea is to remove the bits that force that one right answer. And give the students the freedom to come up with their own possibilities. So instead of just remembering things, they are actually using the language creatively.
I like that.
Which is so important if they want to become more fluent.
Absolutely. Do you have any specific examples from the materials, to make that a bit more concrete for our listeners?
Sure. So imagine a typical past tense sentence completion exercise, something like, she blank at 6 o'clock, leave in brackets.
Right.
Now, the obvious answer is left.
Yeah.
But instead of focusing on that one answer, you could tell the students to ignore the verb in brackets and come up with any past tense verb that fits.
Okay, so it could be she arrived, she called, she waited.
Exactly. Anything that makes sense grammatically and in the context.
That's a great way to get them thinking about different vocabulary options.
Yeah, and how the words work in a sentence.
What other examples were there?
Oh, there were loads. So for gap fill exercises with word banks, you could have the students ignore the banks altogether and come up with their own words.
Oh, wow.
Or for matching exercises, you could remove one of the columns and have the students create their own matches.
So you're kind of taking away the support a little bit.
Yeah, just a little.
And letting them use what they know in a more independent way.
Exactly.
Now, some teachers might be thinking, hold on, if there's more than one right answer, doesn't that make it harder for the students?
That's a fair point, Monica, but actually, our materials address this.
Okay, good.
The key thing is that if students understand the basics, if the grammar or vocabulary isn't too difficult for them, then they can definitely do these activities.
So it's not about making it harder.
No.
It's about giving them more freedom and choice.
Exactly. And, different students have different strengths.
Right.
So these open-ended activities allow them to use their individual skills and be creative.
It makes it more fun for them as well, doesn't it?
Oh, definitely. And the more fun it is, the more they will learn.
That's the key.
Exactly.
Okay, so we've talked about being selective with the content and varying the interaction patterns. Now let's move on to maximizing the impact of the exercises we use. And our resources really emphasize this idea of recycling tasks effectively. So what's the thinking behind that?
Well, the research shows that repetition is really important for learning a language.
Right.
It helps students to remember things and actually use the language more automatically.
So it's not just about doing an exercise once and then moving on.
No, it's about coming back to it and reinforcing what they've learned.
And how do you explain that to the students, particularly with adult learners?
I think you can be quite upfront with them. Explain that you are revisiting something to help them remember it better. And often the second time they do it, it's much quicker.
Right, because they're familiar with it.
Exactly, so they don't get bored.
What about younger learners or learners who are maybe a little less motivated?
Well, our materials had some great ideas for that.
Okay.
So, for example, you could simply repeat a pairwork activity, but with different partners.
Okay, so they are getting a different perspective.
Exactly. Or you could have students close their books and try to remember as much as they can from an exercise or a text.
I like that.
That's a really good way to test their memory. And then there's the classic homework assignment. You could give them the same exercise to do again at home.
Right.
But there are also more creative ways to recycle tasks. Like you could tell students to do the exercise again, but this time add a new word to each sentence. Or change one word, or even delete a word.
And that makes them think about the meaning and the grammar in a different way.
Exactly. It adds a bit of a challenge and keeps things interesting.
So it's all about finding those little tweaks, those little variations that make the repetition more meaningful.
Exactly.
And it links back to what we were talking about earlier, doesn't it? About unlocking creativity.
It does.
You could take an exercise that they've already done and recycle it by turning it into one of those more open-ended activities.
Absolutely. So it's not just about doing the same thing over and over again. It's about finding creative ways to revisit and reinforce those important language points.
So as we wrap up this deep dive, what's the key takeaway message for our listeners?
I'd say it's this. As teachers, you have the power to shape how you use the coursebook. Don't be afraid to be selective and adapt things to suit your students' needs.
And to be creative.
Exactly.
So vary those interaction patterns.
Yeah.
Open up those possibilities for answers.
Yeah.
And get creative with how you recycle those tasks.
By doing that, you can turn the coursebook into a truly dynamic tool for learning.
We really hope this deep dive has given you some practical ideas to take away and try out in your own classrooms.
We do. What new ways will you explore in using your coursebook? We really encourage you to try just one of these tips in your next lesson.
Yeah.
And see how it goes.
And observe what impact it has on your students.
Absolutely.
Thanks so much for joining us for this deep dive here in Cambridge Veritas.
It's been a pleasure.
We look forward to the next one.
We do.
See you then.
Bye.